Welcome to the 26th Annual Writer Symposium by the Sea at Point Loma Nazarene University. I'm Dean Nelson on the journalism faculty at the university, and today I'm interviewing two poets from our own faculty, Katie Manning and Margarita Pintado, who both teach in the Department of Literature, Journalism, Writing, and Languages. They both have published multiple volumes of their own poetry, and their work is featured in many poetry publications and websites. Katie Manning's new book is 28,065 Nights, and Margarita's upcoming book is Sobre Anima. I hope you are as inspired by this conversation as I was when I moderated it. Katie Manning, Margarita Pintado, welcome to the Writers Symposium by the Sea. I feel like I see you in the hallway, we're colleagues, we go to meetings together, but the cool thing about getting to interview you in this kind of a setting is that I've actually read your stuff, which I confess, I was not that educated in all that you had done before, but now I'm really excited about talking with you. And so maybe I should start by apologizing that I don't know all of your work before this, but oh my gosh, do I love the writing that the two of you do. So this is great. This is great. And it'll give us lots more to talk about when I see you in the hallway. But let me ask a couple of general questions first about the role of poetry in kind of in our history. We're a storytelling species, and which has included narrative and those kinds of things, but poetry goes way, way, way back. Some of the ancient stories that we know were actually poems. And so I'm just wondering if I have that right, that poetry is actually one of those kind of original forms of how human beings communicated with one another. Katie, you want to start with that?
Sure. Yeah, you certainly have it right. You can't separate storytelling and poetry, especially if you're talking about the origins of passing stories along. And when you think about oral tradition, there's a very good reason, right? So poetry allows for repetition, rhyme, for all of those memory cues. So that is a brilliant way for humans to be able to pass along fairly lengthy stories and to pass them along through generations, and for people to be able to remember them and to hand them down.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking, at least in the way I've kind of created the images in my own head of how we began as a species. It's people sitting around a campfire telling stories, but Margarita, those stories were actually poems. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure if all of them were poems, but yeah, I think what it reveals is the necessity that human beings have, not only to communicate, right, but to do it artistically, and in a beautiful way. So it's like we're starving for beauty and for art, and the novel does something else, right? The short story does something else, although you have highly poetic novels, right, and short stories, but there's something about poetry, about its intensity, the fact that it can be, and you can have an epic poem that's huge, right? But there's something about the rhythm, something about the intensity of the feeling that it really tries to evoke or capture a big chunk of history in a succinct way. That's what I like about.
Yeah, I just think with poems, there are just some things that are better expressed through poetry than through maybe a prose narrative or an essay or something. For instance, if I'm experiencing some significant grief, the first place I go is to poetry. And I'm just, it just feels almost like a gravitational pull toward poetry. So Margarita, both of you have actually written about grief and about loss, but Margarita, why the draw to these significant kind of life experiences and poetry, at least in my experience, more than the other forms?
Yeah, I guess, it's interesting what you mentioned. I have a lot of friends who are not poets, but they write poetry. And
hold it. How can that,
well,
you gotta explain that.
They don't wanna, they have serious jobs. They don't wanna publish their work. And they don't even consider that what they are writing, it's poetry, right? But they send me, someone who's going through a tough situation sends me an email, and I see, I see poetry in what they're writing, and they intentionally, as a therapy, they write, and what they write is not a novel, it's not a short story. That's not what it comes out. What comes out is just a few lines, a verse, right? So it's just verses, right. And so it's just poetry. It's everywhere. People are thinking in verses sometimes, right? And not everybody wants to publish it or write it down even, but yeah, there's a very direct connection between the experience of suffering and poetry. I'm not saying suffering and poetry directly, because at least I cannot write when I am in the middle of the storm or really suffering. I cannot do that. I can do other things. But after the storm has passed, I go back to the suffering as a way to kind of reconciliate with that, kind of make it my own and understand it and give it some form. And it's liberating, and it's a way to transform suffering into something else.
Yeah. So Katie, does the flip side work as well? Does joy come across just as well with poetry? If I'm joyful, maybe this says more about my darkness, but if I'm really joyful, I don't necessarily go right to poetry. But if I'm in a bad place, poetry, boy, that's it.
I've joked before that people turn to poetry and prayer sometimes in equal measure. But
yeah,
not necessarily when they're joyful, but when they're grieving, when things are. But I think that might be true. But one of the things that I was thinking about is, if storytelling has its origins in poetry or kind of goes back and those are connected, I also think that poetry is larger than storytelling. So poetry doesn't have to have a plot. You can come to poetry with emotion, or you can come to poetry with questions, and you can be really messy with poetry. You can just have an image, or you can have a bit of dialogue and just play with it. And so I think poetry really allows for a messiness, and it allows you to communicate on sometimes an emotional or an associative level that is really beyond the level of storytelling. And it certainly can allow for joy. I've been reading some Ross Gay recently, and I find his poetry wildly joyful. So, yeah.
Well, and as you say, it can take certain elements. And this is what I appreciate about poetry, is that sometimes it's all about something that's very particular and very specific. And it's that there's a focus to poetry, maybe that there isn't to other forms. But I'm wondering, when you're focusing on something that you're writing about, are you also thinking about an audience? And Margarita, this comes back to something you had said before. People who write poetry who aren't poets. It sounded to me like that's because they were writing for an audience. You two write for an audience, though, correct?
Correct.
And is that a conscious thing when you're writing?
Only when I'm editing a poem.
Interesting.
but I don't let it be what dictates what I want to write about, what's there. So an audience, let's put it this way. If I get an invitation to read a poem in the community classroom, for instance, I feel very self-aware of what I'm going to read, you know, what are the kind of poems that are going to be well received. And it's not, you know, it's not about, I don't know, not being authentic, right? It's not about that. It's that part of being authentic, it's sort of recognizing what works with different audiences. So I write poetry. I wrote a poem for that special event. And I did it, so I did it for an audience, but in thinking about the audience, I'm always thinking, what is it that I want to communicate? What is it that I know it's going to resonate? So it's always finding the way to, I don't know, to kind of make a bridge, right? To just bring things together. Yeah.
So Katie, let me ask you just a little twist on that. So when you're writing, you write about some very particular things. Are you thinking about who's going to read this when you're writing it, or are you just writing it?
I think on a first draft, when I'm getting ideas out, I'm just writing. I just let myself write. As I'm revising and going through the process of, you know, crafting the poem, I start to think about who might be reading this and what I might need to do to reach out to the people who want to read this and make it something that they can read and that they can connect with. So
okay. So let's get into some of these particulars. And Katie, you write a lot about bodies.
I do.
And the human body, women's bodies, your body. You write a lot about that. And I saw this really interesting parallel in your chapbook, 28,605 Nights, where you have this line about your grandmother. Your body of work is other people's bodies, which I thought was just an amazing line. But then in your book, Taste the Other, you've got this comparison. I'm looking at my notes to make sure I've got it right, where you've got all of these different ways of measuring the baby growing inside of you, inside your own body of work. And so there was just this really interesting thing where you're measuring your grandmother's body, but you're also measuring this baby's body and your own body. I mean, is this a conscious thing where that you're always aware of these of bodies?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I didn't necessarily set out to like be a body poet, but I did have a professor in my master's program say, you know, we can never experience poetry outside of our bodies. You know, when we're writing poetry, we really need to be speaking to other people's bodies, right? So we need the sensory language that's going to communicate and allow other people to feel what we're talking about, which doesn't mean we have to write about bodies. But yeah, so I guess I think in terms of bodies while I'm writing. And I don't know, I think the things that have drawn me to poetry, especially, I mean, I started writing poetry when I was very, very young. And I think initially it was about playing with language. But as I you know, developed and started caring more about the content of my poems, I have been really drawn to women's lives and experiences. And I don't think you can write about women's lives and experiences without writing about real embodied, you know, experiences, right?
Yeah.
We have some messy lives that we experience through our bodies. So
well,
I've connected those two poems before, so thank you for that.
Well, yeah, sure, but seriously, I read those books kind of next to each other, and I just thought, wait a second, I've seen you measure bodies before, an older dying person and a brand new growing person, and I just thought it was kind of remarkable. But let's stay with this body thing for a second. In your Gospel of the Bleeding Woman, you've got some writing about a body, but it's this person. We only know her in Scripture because of her body and because of what she's doing in this, what her body is doing, and then what she is being drawn toward, the Jesus passing by. She's not named, and because of the tradition, was viewed as this really marginalized, unclean person. And you honor her, and you give her a name. And I just thought that was significant. So how'd you come to that?
So I always was just fascinated by the bleeding woman who appears in 3 of the gospel accounts. I was a Bible quizzer when I was young.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, that answers everything.
Yes. So I was a strange young person who studied Scripture very closely and then competed over knowledge of Scripture. So I was aware of some very minor characters who, had these sort of side stories, and she just always especially fascinated me. And part of it is that it's not her story. She interrupts Jesus during someone else's story. And she is this character who doesn't have a name. She's been bleeding for 12 years. So if that doesn't fascinate you, I don't know what will, right? Like what would her life have been like? And why is she bleeding for 12 years? So I decided I was going to write about her, and I knew that I wanted to do some research. And so I did a lot of research that was scholarly, and I did some research that was not so scholarly, and I mixed it all together, and then I set it aside and did what I wanted to do, which was just kind of let imagination run wild. I did go through Aramaic baby names as if I were, choosing a name for a child, and
oh, wow.
Look at the meanings of the names and think of how to give her a name that felt like it would be meaningful. And yeah, so it was I feel like it ended up being sort of a thin chapbook, but I put a whole lot of time and heart into that collection, and I love her.
Yeah. It was clear. It was clear that you did, and you clearly honored her by bringing her out of the shadow and out of the unclean kind of taboo that she was living under. Margarita, your research, I'm just really kind of drawn to your research about poets and politics in Latin America and in the Caribbean, and the relationship between the artist and the state. Poets and government have never had a very good relationship, as I recall. And you kind of locked in on a particular Lorenzo Garcia Vega.
Yes.
So why that guy, and what have you discovered about the artist and the state?
Wow. Woof. All right. Good luck to me. It's a big question. Why Lorenzo? Lorenzo Garcia Vega, it's a remarkably unknown Cuban writer. And the reasons why he's so unknown is because he was heavily censored, right, by the Cuban government.
Exactly.
And I found him, and I'm going to be very honest. I'm writing a book on him, and I'm getting very excited because more people have been finding him and reading him. And this guy, this is and when I say our, I mean Latin American, right? He is our Beckett he is our Proust, and he remains completely under the radar. In the 70s, late 70s, he wrote an extraordinary book that it's called The Years of Orígenes. It's in Spanish, Los Años de Orígenes, and he sort of exposes everything that's going on within the Cuban Revolution and the way the regime is treating the artists, right? And how they are being forced to exile. Why Lorenzo? Because when I'm confused about, I knew my topic of dissertation, let's put it that way, but I didn't have an author. And my advisor all of a sudden thought, oh, of course, Lorenzo, and he was alive. So we became good friends. I went to Miami and visited him, and we formed a friendship that lasted till we were friends for about like 3 years, and then he died. He was in his 80s when we met. But he changed my life, and he changed the way I think about poetry. I mean, I became a poet for him.
Oh, wow.
He read my stuff, and he sort of approved, and he wanted to do a blog with me, and we did a blog together, and it will be published soon as a novel, co-authored.
Sure.
So yeah, just a brave man. Oh, he was a bag boy in a Publix store in a supermarket in Miami. But he was also this huge figure that people knew. People would go to the supermarket to say hi to him. This is a Cuban national award back in the 60s. He won a big prize. So,
and he's bagging groceries in Miami.
Right, with a lot of dignity, and he wrote a whole book about his experiences as a bag boy, and it's a work of art. So it's just, he proves that poetry can emerge, and it's everywhere. You don't need a formal job. You don't need the things we associate with success. And he wrote about failure, and he wrote about failure in such a brave, honest way that I was drawn to him.
Oh, that's very cool. As I understand, maybe from conversations you and I have had, didn't you consider a career in journalism?
I did, and I kind of started. I did my bachelor degree in communications with a focus on journalism, because I've always been drawn to words, right? And journalism gave me that, or at least I thought so, but.
So where did you go wrong, Margarita? Why did you turn to poetry instead of journalism?
I know. It was a moment where journalism was heavily transitioning to a more online, based profession. And all of a sudden it felt like my job was more similar to a computer.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Than what I thought.
So we'll blame technology.
Yes.
So actually, Margarita, I want to stick with you for a second about one of your poems, The Contortionist. I was drawn to this for a couple of reasons. So it describes a girl that you saw at a circus who could contort her body in all these strange ways to entertain the audience. Okay, all that's a significant part of this. But then there are just a couple of lines at the end of that poem that say, you also contort yourself. And I just thought this whole description, and this gets back to our original point about you take a particular in poetry, you're describing a contortionist. The whole thing could just be about what you're describing as this contortionist. And then you turn it, and you turn it inward and say, actually, I do that too. And this could actually be a general statement about all of the contortions that all of us go through to entertain and be accepted by audiences, specifically about women.
Yeah.
And I just thought, when you were working on that poem, were you thinking of the parallel at the time, or did it dawn on you while you're describing her, hey, wait a second, all of us do this?
That part came after, but it's interesting that I usually don't write about the body like Katie does.
Right.
A poem that is really, but at the end I leave the body, right? And I go to inside, right? You know, my husband and I, we were very deprived, let's put it this way, from art when we were living in Arkansas, in Arkadelphia. In that little town, there wasn't much to do. And a circus came, and it was like the 50s, you know, like the whole town has this feeling. And when I saw that woman who was she was obviously from a country I've never been in, and she was very tiny, and she was doing this spectacle in this small town where most men were older and white, and they were in the first rows of the show, and they were like, the way they were looking at her was, it was just shocking to me. But at the same time, at some point I look at my husband, and my husband was so moved by the artistic expression, because we were living in a desert, let's put it that way. And when this woman is contorting herself, that is art. And I could see how my husband and I were like processing everything, like, this is wrong, this is beautiful, what is this, where are we? You know, all of those things are going through our mind. But once at home, and I start thinking about what I saw and why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling, I couldn't help but identify with her and think that I'm also in this spotlight, in this strange place. I'm not from here, and I have to do all these things to kind of, I don't know, adapt or seem like from there.
Yeah, well, I just thought in just a few lines, you just brought this amazing kind of commentary out of that Contortionist. I thought it was just really well done.
Thank you.
Katie, let's go back to writing about the body for a second. When I use in some of my classes an essay written by Philip Lopate called A Portrait of My Body, he gets really specific, and he gets really personal. And it's interesting how students react to it. Some of them are just turned off and grossed out by the specifics, you know, that he uses in describing his body. But what surprises me is how many students, male and female, I would say even particularly female students, look at that and say, oh, you can write about something that vulnerable. You can write about something that intimate, and it be meaningful. It isn't just voyeurism, or it isn't just narcissism. It's an excuse then, and empowering for them to take the risks that Philip Lopate did in his. And that's kind of how your work strikes me as well, is yes, it has all of this value on its own, but it also has this value to the reader that says, oh, if she's going to take those kinds of risks talking about her body, I can maybe open some doors, some chambers that I've kept closed for a long time. So have you seen that with audiences, with students in response to your work?
I have. I've had, I'm thinking of a poet who I just watched a reading a couple days ago, and in the Q&A afterward, she was talking about her book, which she was writing about motherhood. and someone asked her about poets who had influenced her, and she talked about my book Tasty Other giving her permission to write about motherhood and
Well, there you go.
And the mothering body. And I, as you were talking, I was thinking about not only my own work, but when I teach Lucille Clifton's work, and she has a poem, she has many poems that talk about the body, but especially I love using her poem, Homage to My Hips. And I've had students connect with that poem in so many ways, the way that she talks about, these hips are big hips, they need space to move around. And I've had students choose that poem for their recitation in my class, or choose for their creative response, where they talk about other parts of their own bodies. I had a male student who talked about being overweight when he was a child, and how he responded to that poem so personally. So yeah, I mean, I think that when we write honestly or vulnerably in our own poems, it does give other people permission to do the same, whether or not they're pursuing poetry. It maybe gives them permission to be honest and vulnerable about their own experiences.
Yeah, the hips thing reminded me of Anne Lamott, writes about her thighs as her aunties. And these aunties are always with her and supporting her, and they're, in her view, they were bigger than she wanted them to be, but there you go.
And also, I have taught the Contortionist in my poetry class, and I know my students connected with that poem and have felt that as kind of a personal connection as well.
Yeah, so did they see that sort of twist at the end there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I
Not
agree.
very subtle.
So, yeah. And I do, I mean, I think so many of us connect with that sense of, of being in a situation where we're molding ourselves or getting out of our natural state in some way to try to please or entertain or fit in with others. So
right.
Fantastic.
Wow. So Margarita, let's go back to another one of yours, your poem Still Life. You're describing fruit.
Yes.
Hold it. What did you say?
I love that one.
Yeah, I did too. You're describing
a tiny anecdote. I published that poem first in an online journal, but it's like a website and people can comment. And I love that poem because people hated it. I got the nastiest comments about that poem. And the director of the journal, he loved the poem so much, he intervened in the comments and kind of put things like explain. He had to do like an exegesis of my poem to let people know that it was a solid poem. So go ahead. That's
well, it's kind of cool that a poem can generate that kind of passion. And B, it's even cooler that an editor is stepping in and saying, nope, this is good stuff. So let me ask you something about it. On the one hand, you're describing fruit, but it's so much more than that. Mm-hmm. Can you describe what else is going on in that poem?
Yes, I'm going to tell you how it started. Again, this is a poem I wrote in Arkadelphia. We didn't have many things to do. My husband and I were not super adventurous people. We like to stay home and read and write and talk and go for little hikes, but we're not like, we're going to climb a mountain. So us being in Arkansas, which is the natural state, and it has a lot of things that you could do, was not, we were not the perfect people to exploit, right? The place, to take advantage from it. Sorry, I lost track of.
Well, I'm asking about still life, and it sounds like life in Arkansas was still life.
It was very still. So Walmart became a very important place for us. because it was the only place that was like 4 minutes away. If we wanted to go to another supermarket, we had to drive like 55, like an hour. So our kind of, and also we discovered in Walmart, like it was kind of a social scene, people hanging out in the parking lot, which is very common in Arkansas, gas stations, you know, those are the places where people hang out. I was at home and I saw the fruit that we had just purchased that day sitting on the fruit basket. And I was thinking how the fruit looks so sad under a certain kind of light. It was like 5 o'clock and it was looking sad. And I was thinking that we don't eat as much fruit as we should. So we always end up sort of throwing the fruit away. So I was trying to make a funny poem about how this couple who's kind of bored and we didn't have children yet, we go to Walmart and we just stared at the fruit for hours and the vegetables, and we make like a very, you know, conscious decision of the kind of fruit that looks beautiful. But that's it. Like we don't want to eat the fruit. We're not. It's just sort of a way to stay alive, and you know, so yeah, it's kind of a sad poem, but I wasn't sad when I was writing the poem. That's what I want to point out. I thought it was hilarious, but it wasn't. It didn't come across as funny.
Yeah. Well, what you do is you name all of these different emotions of terror, tears, compassion, all occurring at distinct times of the day as you're looking at this fruit, which of course, you know, you can broaden that out to those are stages that we all go through in our lives as well. So maybe I read way too much into that poem.
No,
but
you're right. Because I'm blaming the fruit. It's like I'm super angry at what the fruit reveals about ourselves, because the fruit is dying right before eyes, and we eat it. So that sort of feel it. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to tell you, maybe this is confessing too much. I'll tell you what else I thought was going on in there. I thought you were describing a miscarriage.
Wow.
That's where my after I just kind of reflected on that poem for a while, and then I looked at the title again, Still Life.
Well, wow, Dean. Well, I'm going to say something I've never said, but I had a miscarriage around that time.
Oh boy. And I mean, not oh boy. I'm just saying, oh my. I'm so sorry.
It was one of those things. It wasn't that dramatic because by the time I found out I was pregnant, it was already miscarriage. So, you know, so it wasn't as bad, but that was present, obviously.
Interesting.
Even though I was trying to, you know, I needed to get tenure. You get so busy and focused.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah. Thank you.
Well, yeah. So, Katie, let me ask you something about your work that I just am so intrigued by. You pay so much attention to how it appears on the page. In fact, I think it's is it the poem "The Belly of the Whale," where the words are spaced in such a way that it looks like the side view of a pregnant woman?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, there's so many interesting things you're doing visually as well as in the content. And so here's something I did with one of your poems. Let's see, which one was it? It was How I Measure Your Body. One of the ones about your grandmother. You have 4 squares of words that look identical as far as length. And I even went and counted the number of words in each square. And they're within 1 or 2, they're identical numbers of words in those squares. Just tell me about this. This is so cool.
Thank you for counting my words. I didn't count words in that poem. I was just looking at the visual squares on the page. So I was.
You're at about 68, I think, per square.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I do sometimes count words and syllables.
I do too.
I'm really interested in numbers and poetry, and I've actually presented on math poetry panels. And I once got at the joint mathematics meeting, which was amazing. But that's a tale for another day. So
really,
yeah. So with that poem, actually, it was a really interesting one to compose. I had made a bunch of messy notes about the different uses of the word body, and I knew that I wanted to create a poem that somehow turned over those different ways that we use body in relation to my granny. And working on this project. And so I had submitted to the Light Ekphrastic, which is this really great magazine that pairs poets and visual artists. And so I sent some poems.
Interesting.
And they chose my poems and they paired me with a visual artist named Carl Sharwa. And they sent me some of his images and they sent him my poems. And so I chose one of his images to respond to. And the image that I responded to had kind of a mannequin that looked like a female shape. And it had these 4 squares behind the mannequin. And so I thought, ooh, maybe this is the form for this poem that I've been trying to write about the body.
Yeah.
And so I got out my messy notes that I had scribbled in my notebook and started crafting this poem. And that was the poem that I submitted as my response for that journal. So
when you're writing a poem, are you, other than that one where you had, it was sort of an assignment, are you thinking visually while you're writing, or after you've written? You are.
Yeah, I think visually, and I also think sonically. So I read aloud to myself a lot while I'm drafting because I want the sounds to be there, but I definitely think about the visual also. And not while I'm initially drafting. I usually let myself handwrite in a really messy way to get ideas out. I think of that as sort of getting the clay. And then when I'm actually bringing it to the screen and starting to craft and do the visual design of it, that's where I'm kind of forming something like if we're going to use the clay metaphor, that's where I'm actually making something that's useful or beautiful, hopefully. Yeah. If it goes well.
Now the clay is on the wheel.
Yes.
Once you've gotten the big glob of clay, now it's the craft part is now it's on the wheel and now you're shaping it.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I was thinking about this recently because I did an interview that was just a print interview where someone had asked me questions about writing, and they were using the word writing to mean drafting. And then they were talking about revision later. And I thought, okay, if I were going to use the word writing to only apply to one stage of the writing process, it wouldn't be the initial drafting. It would probably be revision. That's where I see more of my energy, because I think initial drafting is sort of a frenzied, I mean, sometimes it's multiple stages and I gather those things and then I really craft the poem. And that's really I think that's revision, and that's where I'm actually creating a poem.
No, I'm with you on that. And I think that's true of a lot, many forms of writing. At least that's the way I write. You know, first drafts are you back the truck up and you just dump everything out, right? And then you can kind of piece through and say something in here is worth developing. So yeah, I think I've probably got a similar writing process to both of you. The first draft is a first draft, nothing more than that. So Margarita, this is from, I think, a talk you gave at Calvin College, the Festival of Faith and Writing.
And Katie was there.
Katie was there.
I did. I came to see her.
Yeah.
This was before we had hired, or before you had moved to San Diego, which was very cool. But but actually, I'm going to get to the Calvin thing in just a second. But this is actually from one of your prose, what I would consider a prose poem, where you ask, "What is an event?" And this is what all poets really think about, isn't it? What is an event? That's how you decide what you want to write about. This is an event. Maybe this is not an event. But when you land on this is an event, that means you're gonna do something with this. Is that correct?
Yeah, kind of. In that poem, it's sort of like you don't have to. It's actually about you don't have to write about eventful things in order to be a writer. And again, it goes back to me being in Arkansas, in Arkadelphia, and listening to my fellow colleagues, writers who came to Arkansas and give talks, and they would talk about the importance of the city life, or being in a busy environment in order to keep yourself in check as a writer. It bothered me so much that, and my students would be so bummed out when people, it's like, don't say that to students in Arkadelphia who are writing incredible stuff. It's a myth. So I wrote that one day. I was just staring out the window and I saw a guy who was cleaning his motorcycle, and that's how the poem started. Me looking at this man who I don't know, and now I'm going to invent or create a whole story for him. That's an event. Right.
Yeah, and this is interesting because I remember reading that you were really disturbed by a particular poet who said, if you want to be a poet, you got to live in the city. You got to live in New York. You got to live in Boston. You got to maybe Los Angeles. I don't know. But then you turned to Rilke in Letters to a Young Poet. And what did Rilke's advice tell you about you got to move to the city?
Not at all. Rilke would say, no, you gotta move back to your childhood, because that's where all your poetry is. That's kind of Rilke's view. And of course, I don't only write about my childhood, but boy, it's a rich, there's a lot there, and you never stop being a child. So your perspective as an adult, I don't know, I find in my poems this kind of dual perspective, or this fight maybe between the grown-up and the child, and the things that the child must let go in order to become an adult, and the fear of losing poetry as that process of adulting, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's another line, I think maybe in this same poem that you use from Rilke, that says, to the creator, there is no poverty and no indifferent place. And you took that, and turn your attention tighter is his advice. So you were able to personalize that and say, I don't have to move out of Arkadelphia. I don't have to move to the city. I can, this is not an indifferent place either, right?
Exactly.
So that, yeah.
And it wasn't a conversion in me. It was just, I was confronted by that other view. But, I've always, I can't say I've always was a poet, but I've had always been drawn to poetry and to words. And I never grew up in a city. I think, the whole thing about the city, it's about becoming a professional again, and the idea of success, which has nothing to do with poetry and the value of poetry.
Yeah, so this is a question for both of you about, to continue this, about, is everything an event? Is everything worth writing about? A cute thing one of your kids says, or watching a guy clean his motorcycle, or whatever. So I'll give you an example. I'm here in New Jersey, where it was snowing for 2 straight days. And a couple of mornings ago, I'm walking across the parking lot to my kid's apartment. And I hear the most beautiful song coming from a tree that I just stopped until I saw, here is a cardinal sitting at the top of a tree, framed by a pale blue sky. And I'm saying, there's a poem in there. And so, here's my question to both of you. Is that an event?
So here's my answer. Poets have a chronic problem with the people around us telling us, you should write a poem about that. So we're looking at a cute rabbit outside the window, and the person says, you should write a poem about this.
Oh, I love it.
I don't think that's an event, or it's an event for that person. Like, they should write a poem.
You should write that poem about
yeah. But that's not my poem, right? So I think it's the interaction between the person and whatever it is they're observing or they're experiencing, or whatever it is that they want to respond to. That's what creates the event. But someone can't tell you that you're having an event or that you experience something that should be a poem.
Yeah. Okay. So Margarita, Katie's telling me it's for her, that cardinal after the snowfall, that's not an event.
Well,
is it an event for you? It's my event.
No, there's a part in that poem about the event that you read, Dean, that it said, and this is something I thought about. I was in the beach and I saw like a watermelon open. It looked, it's red. It looked like bloody. It wasn't blood. And then birds were fighting to grab pieces of the melon. And I was wondering if is this an event, or is every bird a separate event? Is the fruit the event? Is the fighting the event? What is the event? So going back to what Kate is saying, absolutely, that she doesn't have to write about the bunny rabbit. That's because it can be an event, but it's not, right? It has to be in the interaction between the poet and the thing that's being observed. I hear birds singing all the time, and sometimes I am just absolutely annoyed by them. Not everything.
That's an event too.
It is, right? But it's not, we're not like, we're not so contemplative all the time, or, trying to turn everything into poetry. I don't have Katie's problem where people are telling her, you should write a poem about that. I feel that people are telling me not the opposite, but like, what are you doing? Writing another poem? It's.
Yeah. Yeah. Or somebody saying, don't write about that.
Yeah.
But Katie, being kissed by Jack Nicholson, that's an event.
It was a dream.
Oh.
That's a fair event.
Okay.
It's Jack Nicholson's event. It's Katie.
Yes.
The dream is still an event.
I had some wild, vivid dreams during my first pregnancy, and they were incredible poetry fodder. I would wake up and scribble down notes and details and many of them were anxiety dreams, but that one was actually more pleasant than most of them. So.
Okay, well, maybe I didn't read it closely enough, because I thought, oh wow, this actually happened. I've never heard this story. Okay, all right. Well, let's address the practical side of writing poetry. Katie, it seems like you are constantly submitting your poetry to reviews and websites and blogs, and then in your spare time, you start your own review publication, the Whale Road Review. You've done 21 editions of that, maybe 22. But obviously the publishing part of poetry is important to you. How important is it?
Well, I mean, there's the the not pretty answer, which is that I'm a professor of poetry, so I need to publish for my job.
No, that's fair.
So there's that. But no, I mean, even if I were not, I think I would still be pursuing publication very actively. And part of it, I think, is that I am an extrovert in every way. And so I really want to connect with other writers and with readers and with editors. And so I mean, I think I write to connect with other people. And so I want that connection with my own work when I'm sending it out. And part of the joy of running my own journal is that I get to interact with my staff and I get to make connections with all of these writers who send us work and with the people who are reading our journal. And so really it's the human connection, I think, that drives me more than anything.
Well, it also struck me, the fact that you started your own review, it also struck me as you're providing a space for other writers in a manner. It just showed, it seemed to me that it was almost an act of gratitude for the space that had been created for you over the years. And so it's kind of both. It's kind of a place to gather writers and celebrate good writing and all that good stuff. But it's also a place to find the young Katie Mannings, the young Margarita Pintados, who maybe haven't had much in the form of publishing. I assume that's rolling around in there too, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of my greatest joys is, I think it was 2 issues ago, we had one writer who was in his 90s and one writer who was a junior in high school, who both is in the issue. And I love bringing, you know, wide age ranges into the journal and bringing people who are from just all different backgrounds. And issue 22 is going to be released next week. And we have, you know, writers from all different continents. And, you know, we've really just gotten to publish such a range of writers and different kinds of poems and short prose. So yeah, I do think of it as kind of paying it forward, and also, yeah, it feels like good literary citizenship. It makes me happy to do it.
I like that phrase. That's a good phrase. Margarita, let's go back to that Calvin Festival of Faith and Writing talk. I've read through your remarks there. I will say the reason I did not attend it, I was there, but I did not attend yours, is I was giving a talk at the same time. I'm just saying.
I remember that.
Okay. Thank you.
I couldn't go to your talk because I was giving a talk.
Yeah. That's what I was fishing for. So why didn't you come to mine?
And I chose Margarita over you.
I know you did. I know you did. Exactly. And I'm a little less bitter now than I was then. But in that talk, Margarita, you said that the phrase "becoming a poet" means intentionally writing for an audience.
I didn't remember that. Thank you.
It's in there. It's in there. So how much does it matter to you what an audience thinks when you're writing for them?
Well, I'm not, you know, because of the sort of poetry I write, I'm not in the position of making people angry or scandalizing. Like I don't deal with shock value, let's put it that way. So besides that innocent fruit poem that got so many you know, reactions, but it's important for me to connect. And when I say connect, I don't want the audience to be indifferent to what I'm reading. I don't need them to like me or to like the poem, but if I can I don't know, if I can hit something there, you know, if I can make them think of something, if I can bother them and they actually needed to be bothered, then I'm happy to do that.
But what about another level of audience, which would be editors and people who are making decisions as to whether to publish? Have you made your peace with not getting everything published? Sometimes rejection is part of the deal.
I have never gotten a rejection, but that has to do with the fact that
what a show off.
No, it's just I haven't sent to so many places like Getty have. And let me put it this way, I have sent things to places that never get back to me. So that's a rejection, but like I don't have it in my memory as, no, we're not going to publish your stuff. We're just going to ignore you. It's okay. But I am pretty happy with my publishing record. I have 2 books. The third one is ready. I don't know what I'm waiting for. I've been sending it to some contest, so I'm waiting for that. But I publish in journals. Most of them are in Spanish, of course, so they're not in my friends' radar. My friends from the US, like they're not there. I will not make any adjustments or changes in order to be published, not out of defiance. I just think that's not the issue, that's not a problem. I don't think. What I can say now, that when I go back to that phrase, when you become a poet, you're thinking of an audience, in a way that's real, is that everything that I write now, it's not to be put away in a journal and never be looped again, like I did when I was younger, right? Everything that I'm writing, I will publish in a journal. I started a website project and it launched like 3 weeks ago. It's a poetry journal. And
what's it called?
Distropica.
Okay. So
you can check it out, distropica.com. And that's also a space for me to publish. I'm really excited. We've had so far like 8 very renowned poets that published there. And so, I plan to continue growing and publishing. Maternity, it's kind of hard and it hits us in different ways, but it's still a challenge having a 2-year-old and in the house to kind of do not the writing, but the other part, the professional thing of contacting people and all that stuff. It's being a little difficult.
Yeah, I think even without a pandemic, having kids at home and trying to maintain a professional life for both of you, it's remarkable how much you have done. Maybe so what gets sacrificed there? Sleep? Are you down to like sleep? Oh boy.
And I mean, a lot. You don't feel it as a sacrifice that much, but when it's time to do your 3rd year review, you realize how much you've sacrificed, because and it's true, it's a reality. And with the pandemic, we're with them all the time. So we start working around 8 p.m. and it's just, we're tired by that point of the day.
Margarita, are you as confident writing in Spanish, in English as in Spanish?
Absolutely not. Or speaking. No, but mostly writing, because I write in Spanish. Okay. Everything, pretty much.
Everything.
I would say that my English writing, it's limited to emails. My communicate, of course, when I'm teaching Lit 2000, I give my whole class in English, of course, and I speak English more than I speak Spanish, but I write mostly in Spanish.
Okay.
I had just began writing a few poems in English and feeling more comfortable. It's way easier than translating my poems from Spanish to English.
Okay. Katie, another thing besides your, it seems like you're always submitting something. You're really active on social media, and I think the YouTube poetry reviews are brilliant. These really small, and it doesn't take maybe the same mental energy or the same time that if you were to review a poem, you know, in a written form. But I just think it's so, they're so accessible to readers. But for you as a poet, social media is part of the deal, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there have been times where I thought, oh, you know, I'm spending more time than I should on social media. I should put this aside for a while. And then I think, no, I can't. This is, you know, this is not only a connection to family and friends, it's also part of my professional life. That's where I'm connected to a lot of writers and editors and journals. And something that I teach my students also is to connect in those ways with writers and editors and journals on whatever social media platforms they're on. Because I don't have to go searching for opportunities to publish. And this is why I'm able to submit as frequently as I do, because I will see, you know, I can get on social media for 10 minutes and see multiple opportunities to submit to a journal, or here's a book contest, or, you know, and so those things are just part of, you know, my informal news intake, or, you know, my Twitter feed. It's just, that's part of the fabric now.
Yeah, well, it's part of how you are aware of what's going on, and it's also part of how you build awareness in others about what you're doing. And yeah, I really admire how you've used social media in that way. One of the other things I admire about both of your works is that if you do mention something in a poem about one of your kids, it's not in that my kids are the most amazing children that have ever been born kind of way, or the most beautiful. I think it was Mary Carr who said anytime she wrote anything about her son, it just came across as just super sappy and just kind of unusable. Do y'all struggle with that if you write something about one of your kids? Katie, you don't?
I do not struggle with that.
Well, because you're okay with being sappy, or because you don't write sappy?
I'm sorry, can you tell what sappy means quickly?
Oh yeah, just cliche-ish,
Okay.
Just kind of so sweet
Okay.
that you would become a diabetic just reading it, okay?
So two things, I think. One is, anytime I have this conversation, I want to push back on the resistance to sentimentality, because I think that that's something
Oh, interesting.
Sometimes gets dismissed because it's associated with women. So that's one point I want to make. But the second point I want to make is that I don't feel like I very often fall into sentimentality. And part of that, I think, is because if you write honestly about motherhood, it is not sappy. I mean, it is dirty and exhausting. And there are moments of sweetness, but they often come after or with or before moments of pain. And so, I mean, I have a poem about my son knocking me over in a giant hug, which is very sweet, but he knocked me over on tile and I tore the meniscus in my knee. So, I mean, so
wow.
I don't really struggle with, so for
you won't be writing a Hallmark card about that.
Right. So for me, the physical reality of motherhood has not been pastels and sweetness and, you know, snuggly, just, you know, comfort, it has been very visceral and, you know, and it is wonderful, but it is also terrible, all mixed together.
Oh, yeah, okay, fair enough. Margarita, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, kids can be the most sort of prophetic, profound, you know, they say things that are just wow, that are the truth. And sometimes, like Katie says, in the middle of some madness, a kid has said something that is just, you gotta stop what you're doing. And it's beautiful, or it's terrible, or it's absolutely artistic, but because a child is saying it, it just compels you. You gotta pay attention to. So I use those moments in my poems, not so much about like my daily routine or stuff, not for anything. It's just these phrases, especially my son who's 5 now, these phrases that just stay with me, resonate, the way he understands things, the way the pandemic has affected him. You know, it's just not negatively, but just, you know, he's growing up in this strange environment. And of course, I cannot escape that from when I'm writing a poem. I wrote a poem at the beginning of the pandemic. I think it was late March. And it was on my son, who is a poem where I'm trying to write a poem, and my son keeps bringing me a picture of a dinosaur that he's working on. So my poem just, I could never finish that poem. The poem ends up being about the dinosaur that my son keeps bringing me to watch. And I shared that poem on social media, which I use a lot. And I've been lucky because I've had editors who are my friends, and then they decide to take that poem that I posted and publish it in their journal. So that's how I use it. But it was remarkable. People loved the poem. And then one person who I respect a lot sent me a private didn't send me a private message, wrote me a comment on the poem and said to me, "This is not a poem," and gave me a very honest critique of what should not be a poem, or, you know, kind of like, this is your frustration. It's what he was telling me. And there's nothing wrong with writing a poem about how frustrated you are. But when he said that to me and I read the poem again, I just couldn't handle that poem anymore. I didn't want to see it. And my friend who wrote that to me was right. And it wasn't a poem. It was me being absolutely frustrated with trying to pursue my passion while my child, who should be my passion to, you know what I mean, in that moment. So it was kind of I appreciate some of my very honest friends. Yeah. Tell me things.
Well, actually, I was just wondering if, because it was a guy writing this to you, just couldn't understand what was going on.
No. No.
Okay.
I'm not. No. I'm gonna go with.
You're just gonna stick with no.
No, you know why? Because my husband, to be honest, it's not a confession, but my husband does most of the domestic stuff. So I'm not writing from, I don't know, from the perspective of a stay-at-home mom with all the kids, and, you know, like, I wouldn't feel too honest. Saying that.
Okay. Well, actually, this is a perfect segue into the next thing I wanted to ask both of you, which is feminism was part of both of your education, especially in graduate school, and is obviously part of your writing as well. So what does that term include? And what do you want to communicate to readers, to your students about that term? It's a loaded word. So what do you want to include in that word? I'm just going to let that sit there for a second until one of you jumps in.
I feel like I keep jumping in first, so I was going to wait to see if
No,
wanted
no,
to-
you're already there. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm here. So when I talk to my students about this, particularly because I teach a women writers class, so we have to talk about this really upfront and define our terms right away.
Right.
So what I tell them is, well, first I ask them what they think feminism is, and we have that conversation. What are your associations? You know, what have you heard? Do you consider yourself a feminist? All of those things. But what I tell them, you know, how I hold this word is, you know, more accurately, we could talk about feminisms, perhaps, right? There are a lot of different ways, and there's an anthology called Feminisms, that there is a plurality to this word, right, to this term. And I think the thing that holds it all together is that feminism is at its heart the idea that women are fully valuable and fully human. And everything else is, you know, stuff that we can argue about. And the thing I've compared this to is Christianity. If you talk about being Christian, there are a lot of things that we can argue about. There are a lot of writers onto Christianity. There are a lot of different ways that people live out Christianity. I think that Christianity at its heart is, you know, something about Jesus, right? Something about Christ, and that we can agree upon something there at the heart. And then people have a lot of disagreement around it. So I think that we do that with a lot of different terms. And I use that obviously since we teach at a Christian university. That's usually a good touchstone for people to understand, okay, we've got this term. We know that there are people who seem to live this out in really different ways or seem to argue about what it means. So what's something at the heart that we can agree on? And then we can see what are these other things that kind of live in this orbit, but that maybe not everyone who uses this term to describe themselves is going to agree upon, or live out for themselves.
Okay. I think that's a great explanation. Margarita, what do you want to add to that?
I never, you know, I don't speak directly about feminism. I don't use the word feminism, not for any reason. It's just that they will, and I let them do it. I let them start talking about that. But the truth is that most of if I'm teaching poetry and feminist poetry, I'm doing it with my upper level classes in Spanish, my majors, or my Lit 2000. And what tends to happen in those classes is that most of them are women. And then, you know, it's absurd kind of to think that women are not, you know, here we are in the university in this class, 90% are women. Of course, many of them are resistant to the term feminism, but that's the thing. They're resistant to the term more than what feminism really is. That's when you know that a term it's being used ideologically, right? Because then they read these poems by women in the 30s, in the 40s, or Sor Juana Inés, who, you know, the nun who wrote in the 16th century, and it's like they are blown away. They admire these women for so the feminism is there, even if they don't want to and they are embracing it, even if they don't want to use the word. So I don't speak directly about it, but we talk so much about women writers, and I try to be, you know, a model in the way I speak to them and the way I try to empower them and encourage them to do things.
Yeah, I think the fact that there are so many women in our school, but also your training and your thinking and your exposure to writers has so informed your own work that it just, whether you name it or not, it just kind of comes through, both of you. So we're going to start to wrap this up a little. Who are the poets that you're both reading now, and that the rest of us should be reading? Give us some Give us some advice here.
Right now, because we're gonna get the second round of the issue for the Dystropica, the second one, I'm reading a lot of friends or poets that are writing right now. And I love that part of this new job is the fact that I can keep reading what people are writing right now. They haven't even published. I always read Lorenzo Garcia Vega, who is, right, my poet.
Yeah, he's your guy.
He's the guy. And I always go back to poets like Mary Oliver, you know, kind of those great classics that give me, help me kind of centered or focus. I'm reading also a Puerto Rican poet that's, his name is Manuel Ramos Otero. He died from AIDS in early 90s. I'm writing a paper on him. So I've been reading those very hard poems on the illness. Unfortunately, many of the poets I read have not been translated into English. And I'm trying to do something about that, which is not easy, but yeah.
What about you, Katie? Who are you reading and who should we be reading?
So I have been reading, I've been reading books by a lot of Black men, partially because I realized that that was a deficit in my reading. I've been teaching a class on women writers and focusing on Black women in the United States. And I took a class like that in graduate school, and I love Black women, and Black women writers are some of the writers who most formed my own, poetic aesthetic. And so I just kind of realized, wait, I have not read a lot of Black men. And so I'm reading, I've mentioned Ross Gay. I've been reading, I've got Terrence Hayes sitting on my desk right now. I've read Jericho Brown. So those are some of the poets that I'm especially excited about and kind of filling in this gap in my own reading. A poet that I'm rereading for one of my classes right now is Charnel Peters, who's a very young poet. And her chapbook Unbecoming is just gorgeous and I love it. And she mixes pop culture with biblical stories, and it's really wonderful. So I recommend that highly. And I think kind of historically, my family decided that we were going to borrow Iceland's tradition of the, Christmas Eve, give each other books and read and eat chocolate, because that's brilliant. And I don't know why everybody doesn't do that all the time. So the book that I got is the collected poetry of Edna St. Vincent Millay, who's one of my very, very favorite poets. So I've been working my way through that and reading over all of her poems. So
that's great.
Yeah.
So you both of you touched on the fact that you are exhausted when it comes time to write, but there are so many things, so many reasons why you could avoid writing. You've got full-time jobs, you have families, you want to have maybe some sort of a social life, maybe once this pandemic, or if this pandemic ends. So how do you still do it? Everybody thinks you have to have these big blocks of time and a retreat in Santa Fe or something. How do you do it? How do you get past all that?
I do it while I'm making breakfast. I have a little notebook on the window right there in the kitchen. I am very intentional about welcoming poetry. I feel that right now, like most of the writing occurs in my head, and then everything else is editing, right? So I'm just surrounded by notebooks, to be honest. And every now and then I leave the kids and I come to the bedroom quickly and I type as fast as I can a poem that I just formed And this is happening, and I love it. It's happening more often. That sort of, I'm ready with a poem. Yeah, I'm in the playground, and I have a little notebook in my purse. So that, yeah, that's how I've been doing it. And since this is the thing that gives me more joy, besides my children, my husband, it's just, it's like when you're playing video games and you shouldn't be playing video games, but you want to just finish this level. So it's just stealing time from other things that the world tells you are more important, but they are not.
Okay. I think that's crucial to get that straightened out. What the world tells you is important and what is not. Katie, how do you do it?
So I do similar things. I have blank notebooks I have one at my desk, I have one by my bed, I've got one in my purse. So anytime I get an idea or I see something or hear something that, seems like it might be interesting, I'll scribble it down somewhere so I can come back to it later. And I have scheduled time for myself. It is on my calendar. So I've been meeting with a group of friends on Friday mornings, and we have a 2-hour block where we just are writing together. I've been hosting the event for our department once a month on a Saturday morning, where
Writer's gonna write.
Students and alumni and faculty can come together and write for a few hours, and we just have a silent writing time. So I've tried to create some spaces where I am supposed to be writing. I'm not supposed to be doing anything else. It's like, this is the thing that I'm supposed to do. And I think giving myself that permission and scheduling it for myself has been really helpful.
That's great.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I do is I don't require myself. I think some people require themselves to be drafting in order to feel like they're writing.
Right.
And so I consider that anything I'm doing in the service of writing, even submitting for publication or anything else that I'm doing around the work of writing, counts as writing. So I never feel like I'm having writer's block or, oh no, I'm not writing, because any of those things count and feel like I'm being productive in that way.
I think that's really healthy to maybe broaden out our definition of what writing is, and which is what you just did. Okay, so final question. It's the question I ask at the end of almost every interview for the Writers Symposium. We've got young poets. We've got people who are not just young, but people who think, oh, I might want to try writing some poetry. Margarita, give them some advice.
Read Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke. It's going to help you. Honestly, everything I could say, it's something I learned from that book, including asking people for their opinions about your poems. Rilke, it's pretty categorical, saying no. When you're asking me if your poem is good, I don't know, it's your poem. It's a sort of like educate yourself to, right? And if you really need to write, and this is the most important thing and crucial thing he says in his book, maybe you are not a poet. It's your job to learn if you're not or are. If you really are, don't worry, you'll be fine. If you're not, it's okay, you'll be fine. You just find another way to express yourself.
Yeah, no, I found that book to be very profound as well, and I reread it every few years. Katie, final word of advice here.
I also love that book. So most people will say, if you want to write or if you want to be a poet, read a lot and write a lot. Those are kind of the big bits of advice. So I will echo those. But the thing I always like to add is connect with other poets and connect with other writers as much as possible in person when we get to be in person again. The more you can do that on social media, find me on social media, the more that you can connect with other people, just for the sheer joy of connecting with other people who do the weird and wonderful thing that you love to do. And also the more that you do that, the more you're going to see opportunities to write and submit, the more you're going to just feel like you have a community of writers, and that will help support you. That'll give you ideas of more things to read and it'll help you on the journey.
Okay. Margarita Pintado, Katie Manning, thank you for this, I thought, really enlightening conversation, and I'm proud to be your colleague. Thank you.
Just a little heads up about next year's Writer Symposium 2022. David Brooks from the New York Times, Cornel West from Harvard University, Nadia Boltz-Weber from Denver, Colorado. They'll all be here. They'll be in person. I hope to see you there. Go online, pointloma.edu/writers for more information.